Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me with a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. A little known 6th century Taoist text, translated as the Statutes of the Hundred Remedies, was created as a practical guide to what enlightened behavior looks like from an ethical point of view. The author translator we're talking with believes each of the 100 spiritual remedies are just as relevant today as they were 1,500 years ago when they were first compiled. Our guest is Greg Ripley, author of the new book, The 100 Remedies of the Tao, Spiritual Wisdom for Interesting Times. Greg is a Taoist priest in the 22nd generation of the Quanzhen Longmen tradition, as well as a nature and forest therapy guide. He holds a bachelor's degree in Asian studies from the University of Tennessee and a master's degree in acupuncture from Northwestern Health Sciences University. The author of The Tao of Sustainability and the Voice of the Elders, he now lives in Golden Valley, Minnesota. Hello, Greg, and welcome to the Pathways Show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, let's start by asking about the subtitle of your book. I mean, what do you mean by interesting times? This reminds me of the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah, I think that's probably what the publishers were going for there. We kicked around a few different subtitles, and yeah, from one perspective, we're always living in interesting times. It's just a question of what kind of interesting, right? Good, bad, all the above,
You know,
chaos.
I
Who knows,
I think
right?
originally it was considered a curse, right?
Mhm.
May you live in interesting times. It'd be kind of nice to live in boring times right now. And we're going to talk about that. Okay, so how did you become a Taoist? And now I understand, but I don't think most people see Taoism. It's not very visible. They're not aware of Taoist temples. They're not aware of it as a religious path at all. What was your path? How did you become a Taoist?
Yeah, well, of course, I was interested in Asian studies, Chinese studies, Eastern philosophy and religion back in college. Interested in Taoism and Buddhism, and just voraciously reading everything I could back then. And got interested in associated arts, Tai Chi Chuan and Qigong and things like this. Eventually led me to acupuncture, of course, as well. And while Chinese medicine is not exactly Taoism, there's obviously a shared worldview and a lot of overlap there. And I think it always just made sense to me. Always kind of clicked. Always kind of felt at home there. And so I think back when I was in college, yeah, Taoism wasn't really um, very obvious in the West, other than through associated things like Tai Chi, uh, Chinese medicine, these sorts of things. And I think the impression that we had gotten from scholars and yeah, kind of our general impression in the West was that Taoism had kind of died out and wasn't really a living religion anymore, other than, maybe in overseas Chinese communities, places like Singapore or Southeast Asia. Um, and I think a lot has changed since then. So, in the
Mhm.
80s, 90s, um, it wasn't very easy to go over to China and wander up to some temple. A lot of the temples were kind of defunct and in disrepair, and a lot of people had kind of gone back into society, during the Cultural Revolution and all those times, of course. And then since then, there's been a huge revival in China, and Taoism has kind of reestablished itself with its infrastructure and kept its lineages alive, and yeah, it's kind of going through a big revival there. And so it's I kind of feel like, as a living tradition, it's kind of coming to the West now, where Buddhism was maybe 30 years ago, with
Mhm.
when Zen priests started to come west and started to teach Westerners, or when
Right.
Tibetans started to come to the West. And at that time, there weren't really any Taoists coming to the West, or, there were people teaching a bit about Taoism here and there through their arts, but not really in the way that those other traditions were.
Well, I know that I actually went to China and I
Mhm,
gave a speech there in Beijing at a conference about the I Ching, which I had been devoted to since I was in college. And I ended up creating a software version of it.
mhm,
And they were all excited. And I know during the Cultural Revolution, this stuff was really banished and really repressed. But
mhm,
when I went there and gave this talk, I was amazed at how much interest there was. And I was also amazed at how much ignorance there was because the Cultural Revolution had just sort of like, you know, squelched anything even remotely religious. And I thought, wow, I mean, if I was in the Communist Party, I would be promoting this. I mean, this is like Taoism is like, doesn't really bother with that kind of thing at all. But they thought I was a great reformer because I had written this English version. It was really a kind of an extrapolation of the Wilhelm Baines version for modern times. So I understand what you're saying, and so I guess I'm kind of a Taoist in a sense that I resonate with that. But is Taoism really a religion?
mhm.
Is there really a belief system attached to it that makes any difference? I mean, does it really matter what you believe?
I like most things in Taoism, I would probably say maybe, or yes and no, that kind of thing, right?
Could you
It's
be a little more
I think
vague?
there's I definitely think there's a yeah, yeah, right. I think there's definitely a worldview there that underlies it, right? And
Right,
that,
right.
I mean, if we want to take religion in the widest sense, then certainly is and can be perceived that way. But it's one of those things that I think it can be approached from a purely philosophical standpoint. It can be approached in a much more religious sort of way or spiritual way, because people are not comfortable with saying religion anymore. They want to be spiritual but not religious, and you can certainly do that with Taoism. Um, but yeah, I think once we've broadened our idea of what religion is beyond, hey, we're used to Western monotheistic traditions and that we call that religion, and then this other stuff we're not so sure about. I think in the widest sense of a a body of ritual and practice with a coherent worldview that people have passed on, um, in the same way that Hinduism is a religion or Buddhism is a religion, then certainly we could say Taoism is a religion as well. So
I think the problem is that in the West, the Abrahamic religions are so belief centric. They
yeah.
basically demand that you accept this belief system that is, backed up by their ancient scriptures, and you take a literal interpretation of these ancient scriptures, and by whatever your faith, you're saved. Whereas I
Yeah.
think in the East, you've got Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. You have to save yourself. It's not like the Buddha saves
Mhm.
anybody. It's basically you know karma, and it's your responsibility to to find your own way. And that's really what I like about it, and that's what kind of converted me to the Eastern spirituality. Okay, so let's talk about this book. The Hundred Remedies. How is this different than the Tao Te Ching, which is obviously the most famous Taoist classic, along with the I Ching, which I'm
Yeah.
very familiar with?
Yeah, so this comes quite a bit later. This would be, like we were saying, probably 5th or 6th century, and it's really a precepts text. It's part of a larger group of texts. Um, it's when Taoism during the Tang Dynasty was kind of or moving into that time period where Taoism was kind of had a real dialogue going with Buddhism, right? So they were both influencing each other a lot. Um, you know, kind of more Chinese forms of Buddhism were kind of developing. And Taoism was taking a lot of structure, certainly, from Buddhism. I don't know. I think they found a lot in Buddhism that resonated with what their own teachings, what they already had, things from the Tao Te Ching. And so I a lot of times people will be like, find something that sounds familiar, they'll be like, oh, they just took that from Buddhism or whatever. And it was much more complicated than that, of course. But yeah, so it's a precepts text, but what makes it kind of unique is the way it's presented as sort of spiritual remedies. It's not thou shalt kind of rules, but it's like doing this is a remedy, as in you'll have certain situations or problems in life or ways of thinking that cause problems. And if you do X, Y, Z, it can be a remedy for that situation. So
So it's
I
about
felt it was,
ethics.
yeah, it's about ethics, and I just felt it was very approachable and very applicable to everyone's life, whether they're trying to live a more monastic or hermetic sort of lifestyle, or whether they're out in the world and have a family and a job and all that good stuff. So yeah.
We don't hear very much about lay Taoists. We'd usually hear about,
Mhm.
the crazy wisdom of Taoist hermits and that kind of thing. We
Mhm.
don't hear about it as a daily practice or as a kind of a regular religion. What is there kind of like a religious community of norm of average everyday citizens that are practicing Taoism and identifying with it?
Yeah, there are, and certainly in China and the Chinese diaspora, overseas communities and stuff. Um, the two main branches of Taoism as it exists today, they kind of are grouped into Quanzhen, which is typically more monastic and living in temples, living that kind of lifestyle, and Zhengyi, which is kind of an umbrella for a lot of the other lineages who often pass down lineages through the family. So even if someone is a priest performing ceremonies and rituals for their community, they will usually have a family and kids, and that's how it's passed on. So there's there's both traditions there. The monastic tradition, there was always that kind of hermetic tradition, but more formal monastic communities and stuff like that was kind of some of that influence from Buddhism. But so you have people who live in temples, people who live family kind of householder lives, um, and everything in between, I suppose.
So, how would you differentiate Taoist practice as a householder from
Mhm.
Buddhist practice? Is it any different? I mean, is there anything other than meditation that would be involved or central to it?
Well, it's I mean, in a lot of ways, it's very similar. You typically like people who are familiar with, well, if you're familiar with Zen, of course, it's very meditation centric. Um, and that's kind of the core of it, not so much, um, recitation of things and stuff other than like the Heart Sutra, right? And then Tibetan Buddhism, you have the other extreme where there's a lot of chanting, a lot of liturgy kind of stuff, right? And so Taoism is kind of can be approached in a lot of different ways. You could focus on meditation and internal alchemy, um, uh, longevity practices, those sorts of things, studying the I Ching and all and the scriptures. And then you can also practice daily liturgies. There's morning and evening liturgies, and different days throughout the month where you might do different practices, similar to, like if people are familiar with Tibetan Buddhist communities that like will follow the calendar, and certain days they'll do certain practices and get together. Um, there's a similar kind of setup in Taoism as well. So certain rituals on certain days, that kind of thing.
One of the central concepts of Taoism is Wu Wei.
Mhm.
And it's a beautiful concept, but can you please explain that for us?
Yeah, I would say the best way to understand Wu Wei is probably like non-contrived action or uncontrived action. Um, action that is very sort of natural, um, isn't really kind of clashing with reality or with others. Kind of that idea of going with the flow and all those things. But on the one hand, it's something we work towards. We can't just like be like, hey, I'm just doing what's natural, you know. Um,
Let it all hang out.
that's right. We can't just let it all hang out. Eventually, maybe we can, but I think it takes some self-cultivation to get there and realize what that looks like. So one way to look at the precepts is kind of like they are a reflection of what, you know, the Taoist sagely behavior would look like. So instead of, you know, the Buddha or a Bodhisattva or something in Buddhism, we, you know, in the Tao Te Ching, we look at the sage. Even in the I Ching, you know, you talk about what would the sage do, or what would the Junzi do. Um, and and so it's kind of like, here's a model of what their behavior would be like, and we can kind of try to model ourselves after that until those things become natural to us. And
Right.
you know, the most appropriate action would be another way of looking at Wu Wei. So whatever's the most appropriate action to take in a certain situation, when that just comes naturally to us and we just do it without a second thought, then there's some Wu Wei.
You know, I find the philosophical backdrop of Taoism to be like the biggest benefit of it, because one of the
Mhm,
issues that I think that we have to confront with modern Buddhism in the West and modern Taoism in the West probably too is the fact that most of what was written and most of what was compiled in favor of practice was pretty monastic in terms of its orientation. And they kind of had a
mhm,
division of labor. You know, you had the lay people and you had the monks, and the lay people
mhm,
supported the monks, and the monks kind of did the heavy lifting when it came to spiritual practices for the community. And
mhm,
I don't think that really suits the West. In other words, this integration of these monastic practices with the life of a layperson, that's the real challenge of modern spirituality. And what are your reflections on that?
yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Yeah, we don't have that traditional model, other than maybe if we think about Catholicism or something like that, right? Maybe that's a similar kind of situation, you know, your parish priest and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's not
Right.
really the way things work in the West these days. So just as, yeah, Buddhism is sort of developing sort of Western forms, or what works or what makes sense in the West. I'm sure Taoism will be doing the same. Um, and yeah, it's more focused on integrating the practices and the principles and the philosophy into your daily living. Yeah.
Right. And I think your book actually highlights that by bringing forth these ethical principles, these 100 remedies. And it's a book about ethics, really. It's about how to
Mhm.
live your best life. And you have these 100 things that go back to whenever it was, 500 AD, or I don't know when it was written. I don't remember, but
Yeah.
it was a long time ago, 1600 years ago, and so much of it is so relevant. And I uh really enjoyed looking through the 100 remedies. um so many of them were so timely, like remaining in unruffled in catastrophic times.
Mhm.
Well, There's a challenge. That's something that we're having to deal with now. And you mentioned
Yep.
climate change. Your book is very modern in that sense that it's applying these ethical principles from Taoism to modern times, including how to deal with issues that we can't fully control, but that do cause a lot of consternation and anxiety. Um, so I really appreciated that. There were so many of them, it's like another one, number 52, cool as a cucumber. I don't think that's a direct translation, but it's remaining self-possessed even in calamity. And that's a
Yep.
remedy. It's one of the 100 remedies. And then you mentioned in that context that the virtual world of the internet and social media is almost wholly engineered to get a rise out of us one way or another. And oh my God, it's so successful at doing that. Of all these 100 remedies, I mean, are they all equal? How do you propose that the average reader benefit from this particular exposition?
Well, I think yeah, it's funny, the remedies themselves are very short. And I really tried to unpack them and show how, the entire tradition can be, looked at and reflected upon from these very terse little sayings. And drawing, examples and quotations and things from the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi and the ancient philosophical texts on up through the whole tradition. Um, and yeah, since there are 100, I thought a nice way to do it, you could just read straight through. It might, for some people, that'll be great and they'll love it and they'll want to do that. But for most people, you could read one a day, one passage a day, couple pages, kind of ponder, think about, and maybe even take that as a theme, for the day or the week. And as different situations arise, you can reflect upon the principles that are found there and how to apply them. And there's a saying in Taoism and internal alchemy and even in martial arts that, it takes 100 days to build the foundation. And so, you could take one of these a day and read them, and after 100 days, you're gonna feel pretty grounded in Taoist ethics, I think.
Well, I think you've done a wonderful job of unpacking them. It was very readable and it was enjoyable. And I love the way you brought in all the modern
Mhm.
situations that we're dealing with that are reflected in these principles that go back so far. Now, I want to talk about another thing that you're doing that's kind of related to Taoism. In fact, I want to ask you, how is it related? You're a nature and forest therapy guide.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What does a forest therapy guide do?
Well, most people are pretty familiar these days with forest bathing and Shinrin-yoku as kind of the modern Japanese iteration of it. And yeah, it's really about nature connection and nature relatedness, getting us back in touch with the natural world. Um, you know, Thinking in terms of climate change, part of our problem has been we've become so disconnected, right? And if our daily lives are too far removed from the natural world, it's kind of like we lose touch with what's happening and we don't notice until it's too late. So, we care about, or we pay attention to what we care about, and so um, if we get people back in a relationship with the natural world, then we're more likely to survive these coming times a little more unscathed, for sure. So
Well,
nature
this
and forest
seems, yeah.
therapy. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say
I
nature and
was just
forest.
going to say that I was just going to say that this is like the essence of Taoism. It's like the relationship with nature and nature as our
Yeah.
teacher. Water, the life
Mhm.
in the natural world. So this seems like this would mean a resurgence of Taoism might be good for the planet in the light of climate chaos, etc.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very yeah, it goes together very well. Taoism looks to the natural world, for its guideposts and examples of how to live and how to work. You know, we're all part of the ecosystem or the world or the universe or whatever we want to call it. Uh, so we call it the Tao. You know, that that big mystery that's beyond naming. But we can see how it works in the world through nature. Yeah.
And you wrote another book called The Tao of Sustainability, which I'm sure is on this topic. What is that book
Yeah,
about?
exactly. That one was more focused on nature connection. Yeah, it has meditations and practices of nature connection and it I'd like to think my writing's improved quite a bit from 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago when I wrote that, but I think it's still very timely and has some very useful exercises, practices people can do.
So if we're pretty much running out of time. So if you wanted to offer our audience some parting words of advice or wise counsel, or just summarize the essence of what you're trying to express, what would you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, dealing with climate change is a big part of my writing, whether I'm writing more strictly about Taoism or nature connection. And so, I mean, that's really the big issue of our time. We have lots of other issues. They are interesting times, lots going on. But if we can learn to be flexible and adaptable, less reactive, and deal with things as they come, work together as a human family, because we're all in this together for sure. We will all come through better. So yeah, Taoism offers a lot of tools and a lot of wisdom on how to live a better life, a happier life, a smoother flowing life. So that's what I
Well,
wanted to offer to people.
no, you've done a great job, and I really enjoyed the book, and I'm going to be looking at it a lot. 100 Remedies, some of them are very profound, are very relevant, and thank you so much for being with us today. There's so much more we could explore, but we've basically run out of time. And I want to make sure to tell our listeners about your website, which is gregoryripley.com. That's
Yep.
Gregory, Ripley.com. And I'm sure that people can find a lot more about your work and how to get in touch, etc., at that website.
Yep.
And for those who may have tuned into Pathways late today, this is your host, Paul O'Brien, author of Intuitive Intelligence, a book that shares the theme of pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. Now, don't worry, you can play or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or as a free podcast, and I'll tell you how in a minute. Today, we've been visiting with Gregory Ripley, author of The 100 Remedies of the Tao, Spiritual Wisdom for Interesting Times. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast and streamed on the internet at www.kboo.fm every Sunday morning at 8:30 USA Pacific Time. Even better, podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com. That's spelled DIVI nation.com, as well as via iTunes, Paulo's YouTube channel, and other free podcast servers. And I might as well mention, while we're on the topic of Taoism, that divination.com also features the visionary I Ching, which is an offering that I created where people can access the ancient Taoist oracle. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and Podcast. And thanks again to Gregory Ripley and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.